Boa tarde a todos. Ah, todos me escutam bem?
Boa tarde. Sim, eu escuto
Good
bem.
evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Tiaços,
Yes.
Tiaços, no seu quarto ano de atuação, né? Hoje recebendo um convidado bastante especial. Muito prazer em receber o analista junguiano Leslie Stein. Leslie, um prazer te receber entre nós. O Leslie foi sempre muito ágil, muito rápido e muito receptivo e gentil nos nossos convites. Então, foi muito fácil convidá-lo, foi muito fácil ele ter aceito o nosso convite. Estamos aqui. Queria apresentar formalmente primeiro o Leslie. Leslie Stein é analista junguiano com prática clínica em Sydney, Austrália. Ele é autor de 13 livros, incluindo Trabalhando com Experiências Místicas na Psicanálise, o Self na Psicologia Junguiana, Teoria e Prática Clínica. Leslie Stein é vencedor do prêmio da IAJS de Melhor Livro Teórico de 2021, Atingindo a Totalidade, a Equação de Jung para a Realização de Deus, e ele também escreveu os romances A Jornada de Adam Cadmon, um romance, e A Psicanálise do Dr. Zill, que vai ser publicado ainda. Ele é o editor de Práticas Orientais e Individuação, Ensaio de Analistas Junguianos, publicado pela editora Quiron, Psicodélicos e Individuação, Ensaios de Analistas Junguianos, junto com Lionel Corbett, também pela editora Quiron, e de Variedades sobre o Nada, também pela editora Quiron, que está no prelo. O Dr. Leslie Stein também faz parte do Conselho de Administração da Fundação Philemon. Nós convidamos o Leslie para falar sobre esse livro dele, O Self na Psicologia Junguiana. É um livro que, como nós conversamos anteriormente, é um livro que custou muito, né, Leslie, fisicamente a você, né? Tem uma série de histórias interessantes sobre os acontecimentos em torno dele. É um livro absolutamente importante, rigoroso, porque ele cobre um vastíssimo percurso da conceituação de self em toda a obra, em todo o projeto teórico da psicologia junguiana, uma obra de fôlego, uma obra muito bem escrita, detalhada, rigorosa, e eu achei fundamental que nós, nosso público brasileiro, a comunidade junguiana brasileira, representada aqui pelo Tiaços, pudesse ter a oportunidade de ouvi-lo falar sobre esse tema. Leslie, prazer te receber. Obrigado por você ter aceito o nosso convite. A gente está muito feliz em te receber. Por favor, fique à vontade, a casa é sua. Muito obrigado.
Well, thank you so much. This is an interesting topic for me. You've asked me to speak on what do we do with this Jungian self in the consulting room when we're seeing patients. I'm working on a paper at the moment and a presentation for the JAP. Okay, so at the JAP conference in Essex, and I'm giving that next month. So what I present here to you are my working ideas, and I would really appreciate your insights and comments on this question about what do we do with the self in the consulting room. But, when I was beginning to contemplate the theme of this talk and the JAP presentation to come next month, I was reminded of a synchronistic experience that occurred in the mid-1980s. I was part of a United Nations team to go to Varanasi, which was the holiest city in India, to report on the state of urban planning, which was a bit odd because it's functioned for 2,500 years without planning. But nevertheless, I went to Varanasi, and I was in Jungian analysis at that time, my first analysis, and was deep in reading about the Liverpool dream that Jung explains in Memories, Dreams, Reflections on the train coming over from Delhi. This is where the Liverpool dream is where Jung indelibly discovers and names the self as the center in psyche. So on my very first day, before my official duties began, I walked down to the Ghats, the steps leading down to the Ganges, and was sitting there, and near me was a sadhu, an orange-clad itinerant monk who, it turned out, was a retired professor in the last stage of life as a renunciate. In his telling me about his new life as a renunciate, he kept on referring to the word Atman, interchangeably with the word self. The Atman in Hinduism is indeed the self. It's a comparison Jung began concentrating on as early as 1937, 10 years after the Liverpool dream, and continued using the idea of the Atman as the prime example of the self. The Atman is said to be, in Hinduism, the indwelling drop of the all-encompassing Brahman that dwells in our hearts and longs to be absorbed in totality. It's as old as time. It's mentioned in the Rig Veda of 1500 BCE. Pardon me, and it's a solid concept for 1.4 billion Hindus. It's not a mere idea. So I read to this sadhu, I read him the Liverpool dream in detail, and he said to me, oh, that's certainly a dream of the Atman. That is, as he put it, and is exactly as Jung put it, the divine within, that which directs us, or as Jung puts it, the ruler of the inner world. And this really stuck with me because this concept is not only so deeply embedded in India, but it exists in some form or in so many other traditions. Catholicism, it's the Holy Spirit. In Islam, it's the Ruh. In Judaism, it's the Ruach HaKodesh. It's been expressed so many ways in literature as a guiding spirit. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the Oversoul. Borges called it the Aleph. And it's a book of his called the Aleph about it. And yet the self, as explained by Jung, seems to have had little traction in the logos-driven West among other psychologies. So though other aspects of Jung, such as the shadow and archetypes, have had great traction. I think this is because, as Jung says in Mysterium, quote, metaphysical judgments are incommensurable with human reason. It's interesting for me when I try to get a feel for this. So 2 weeks ago, I was invited to give a university-wide lecture on numinous experiences and the self in light of psychedelics, what effects psychedelics has on that. And I walked into a wall of other professors who were protesting at question time, telling me the self is a useless concept because it's not subject to reason. There's no proof of it. It's not even philosophy, they said, and it's inconsistent with modernism. It was a good lesson for me. I'll never do that again. I won't do it as a university thing to people who are so oriented to logos. And I should have listened to Jung's comments where he said, quote, it's wiser not to drag the supreme metaphysical factor into our calculations. So because it's beyond reason, it's been regularly doubted in the pages of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, in other journals, as nothing more than an abstraction. One scientist even referred to it as an abomination. It has, in fact, if you think about it, no intellectual tradition and has been misunderstood by many, as even Fordham did. because of a wrong translation of an Eranos lecture, which I'll discuss. When it was translated from the original German into English, the key parts were left out. It's been confused by other mistranslations, one of which Murray Stein wrote about in the Journal of Analytical Psychology. And it's now sort of relegated as kind of a catch-all for wholeness or to interpret dream symbols. I've found, because I've taught at a lot of Jungian training institutes, it's taught in different ways in training institutes. Some institutes it's closer to the small s self, the sense of self, defenses of the self, and so on. But it's no surprise to me, because in 2019, I don't know if any of you were there, I gave a paper at the IAAP conference in Vienna, and I expressed the view of the self as being very much like a magnet that attracts everything necessary to it, a concept I derived directly from Aeon, volume 9.2. And in question time, one participant, I think he was a German man, he jumped up from his chair and he says, "I strongly object. You have no idea of what Jung said." I was shocked by that. And as I walked out, another man came up to me and said, "Oh, at last somebody's explained what Jung really meant." I was very confused. And then I submitted the paper to the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and I got back 2 referees' reports. One said, "I had no idea what I was talking about." And the other said, "Well, at last it's been properly explained." And I think that last experience prompted me to write a book on the self. But I wondered as I was writing it, and this is the essential question of today, it being so vague and confusing, what are we supposed to do with it with patience? Even it's so confusing, even amongst ourselves as Jungian analysts. What do we do with it? It's clear for analysans that the self will be way too strange, a bizarre hypothesis, and one that I therefore tend not to bring myself into sessions. I don't try to elucidate it. I don't use it to provide a framework, even when there are symbols of the self in dreams. I put these down if I discuss them as symbols of a developing wholeness. If there's a dream symbol or a situation of a guide appearing or a similar personality in an active imagination, I would note what it means, but I'd never mention the self, as I'd not be able to express it in other than as a vague notion. The idea that I think we all harbor, that working on the ego will eventually create some realization of the self or an awareness of its nature and its agency, most importantly, some sort of lasting sense of it for the patient, is not something I really see often in long-term analysis. Occasionally people get a glimpse of it or an idea of it, but it certainly doesn't stay as a full realization. Yet this phenomenon of the self appears specifically in all religious and spiritual traditions, such as the Atman in Hinduism, Jung's principal comparison. It's actually in these traditions where it exists with great clarity and doesn't require explanation. I think I found that out when a woman came to see me in her 50s who was dying of ovarian cancer, and she was a committed Sufi in the tradition of Ibn Arabi. And she spent decades studying and doing that work in Turkey. And as a younger woman, I was fascinated. She even went to see John G. Bennett, who was the London-based follower of Gurdjieff. She was really an extraordinary person. It was a privilege working with her, and she spoke naturally about the root of Sufism, described in Ibn Arabi's writing exactly the same as Jung describes the self. He said that this is the words of Ibn Arabi, he said that the root drives the nafs, the desires. So in other words, as Jung would put it, the root is the mover to the moved, to the ego. As we were meeting many times a week, I ventured to ask her eventually, well, this is Jung's self. Is there a parallel? And I was prompted to do so because she saw the Rue as the divine within that gave her meaning at the end of her life. And she also used the words, and this triggered me into doing this. She said, the Rue is the ruler of my inner life. Again, the same exact phrase used by Jung in English and in German. So she accepted the Jungian self, I realized, as self-evident. She had no problem with it because the stronger myth that she lived informed the weaker Jungian myth. So this opening and explanation is really to say that the self is not confined to the Jungian opus. And it's possible that we can even find a door to realizing its existence elsewhere than in Jung's ideas, where it may be better expressed, stronger in details, more accessible. We need to bring the Jungian self alive somehow because it is unfortunately a weak myth for several reasons. The first, it's not explained well by Jung. It took me many years, 800 pages over 2 books to try and unravel what Jung meant. It was never a single bounded concept for him. It was always an evolving idea arising from his first confirmation of its existence in the Liverpool dream. The evolution of the idea arose, if you think about it, entirely from his pure subjective revelations. He didn't rely on reason, didn't rely on philosophy, and stating in the Liverpool dream when he was 52 that this is actually what brought me to the self. But the Liverpool dream was not explained to us in any detail. We didn't know about it until the publication of Memories, Dreams, Reflections when he was 82. That's when it was published. He did mention it in the collected work somewhere as a dream of a patient, but not a dream of his. So it had no gravitas there. It had no force. It was just part of a wider narrative of various dreams. So from the time of the Liverpool dream, without referencing that revelation, he then spent decades trying to explain to all of us his own continuous ongoing insights in different ways as his revelations changed, as did the context in which he was discussing the self. The second reason why it is a weak myth, and this is what I alluded to earlier, is that in 1935 at an Eranos conference, and I went to one a couple of years ago. It was just fantastic to be there at Eranos in Ascona, Switzerland. He made a statement that was mistranslated later in the English edition of the collected works, as I mentioned. I'm not sure if this is carried through to the Portuguese Brazilian collected works, but I assume it was because that was based on the English edition. I was told that this error did not get picked up by Jung because, interestingly, he didn't get involved in the accuracy of translations. So somehow this misleading statement snuck through, completely changing the meaning of the self. And I'll explain what that was. The statement, correctly translated from German, from the Eranos lecture, is that the self is the center, and through understanding the center, it can evoke totality. But he says, only to the extent it is realized by an individual. In other words, a man of personality or someone who can realize aspects of totality. But the self is not totality in that sense. It can evoke totality, but only to the extent it's realized by an individual. I discuss it in the book because it's a complicated idea. This was unfortunately translated in the collected works as, quote, the self is a center and totality, without the caveat that it's the extent it's realized, making it very confusing and leading to Fordham's error in dismissing the self, as I explain in detail in my book on the self, which I won't go into in more detail. So in the late 1930s, after the 1935 Eranos lecture, the idea of what the self was really hung in the air. It wasn't until 1939, 4 years later, that Jung wrote to Erich Neumann, then in Israel, and said, I'm going to try and engage with the self in terms of, quote, Hindu introspection, meaning he was going to engage with it in relation to the Atman, where he went on in that same year to use the Atman to explain the self in his seminars on yoga and also in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius in 1940. But how it was viewed and understood at that time, after he had the dream in 1927 and he made that statement in 1935, is explained best by a book that Yolanda Jacobi wrote in 1942 in a chapter called Practical Applications of Jung's Theory in her book, The Psychology of C.G. Jung. And in her words, the self she called, quote, a borderline concept, a postulate, a heuristic maxim. And in support, she quoted as proof that it's really weak, Jung's earlier statement that individuation, realizing the self, is, this is Jung's statement, quote, a very obscure field, much in need of investigation of the centering processes in the unconscious. This was a statement Jung made in epilogue of volume 12 in 1937. So we get to 1941, and Jung's in his 60s, and he made his first attempt there to ground the self at a wartime Eranos conference by making the practical statement, it seemed, that to realize the self, what we always talk about, the ego work must be done up to a point, and then the self will take over. However, and that's the way we probably understand it, that the ego's work, the work of psychoanalysis must be done, and then the self will come in. However, he adds a confusing footnote that the capacity of this ego work is up to the self. Now, so what does that mean? Is it all the self, or does the ego actually have a role in addition to the self? I see this in the context of the conference. What he's trying to do at that conference is a strong attempt to take this self, which is floating in the air, which Yolanda Jacobi said is just a postulate, and try to fit the role into his evolving psychoanalytic theory, but yet it's very unclear. It's actually a time when Deirdre Baer, one of his biographers, said Jung was, quote, unfocused. I want to say a few words about this conference where the statement is made, because you can see what he was trying to do. What's most interesting is that this entire 1941 wartime conference was focused on the importance of myth, the subject discussed by every participant. In fact, Kerenyi, the Hungarian philosopher, gave a lecture directly after Jung's. Jung had emphasized in his talk Kerenyi emphasized the critical importance of myth and how it was the greatest influence on society, and that it's what creates norms of civility and hope. The conference took place in the period of his collaboration with Kerenyi, whose work on the myth of the Kore you might know about. Jung wrote and said he really admired that work. So he knew that it was myth that he had to turn to for the self, for it to be held up, because it had no other basis than his yet unpublished revelations about the Liverpool dream hadn't come out. Nothing else had really been said. Now, the myth of the self, the idea of it, standing as a sort of naked idea that defies logic, has been attacked by so many analysts. James Hillman attacked it, said it was useless. Fordham attacked it. Gigerich attacked it. George Hoganson attacked it. Zilkin attacked it, part of a very long list. And I think this is because of Jung's inability to convincingly ground the myth, and the proof of that lack of acceptance is most evident in his late inclusion of the self the definition of the self in the definition section in the German edition of volume 6. You have that in your edition, the Brazilian edition as well, in volume 6, the definition section. He did that when he was 82, and he framed it this way. He said about the self, the definition, quote, "The concept of the self would be a vain speculation were it not for the fact that it designates symbols of unity that are found to occur empirically." So this shift so late in his life is to say that, okay, I can't prove it, but only through symbols and dreams it's proven. They actually are symbols of unity that were found to occur in the dreams, which is empirical. He had to do that at 82. He'd spent his whole life talking about it because there was no other way for him to bolster or provide proof of the myth. This attempt to provide some means to prove the self that he had not done for the previous 3 decades, turning instead to complex Gnostic ideas as its parallel when he was writing Aeon, to try and explain the self, they couldn't stand on its own as justification for its meaning. It's true that the comparisons he chose by going into the Upanishads and the Atman were probably too esoteric, as Fordham pointed out, too mystical, and the self was not accepted at all by the psychological community of his day or even his own colleagues. So Jung suggests in the definition section, okay, I can't prove it, but let's say the symbols are actually there. Now, if you go with me for a moment and think about this, the problem is it takes a particular prior orientation to say, for instance, that a spider represents the self. It requires that you first are convinced about the myth, that you believe in the self, and therefore you actually say, oh yes, the spider is a good representation of it. You know, this use of symbols to provide a theory was actually the lament of Jacques Lacan about Freud's work, that he influenced. He created his whole opus by using symbols, but you had to understand what he meant before you could actually understand the symbols. But finally, about this topic of why it's weak, the biggest weakness, and one that is insurmountable, is that he says very clearly that the process of individuation is the realization of the self, the process of the realization of the self. It's a direct quote, I'm not summarizing, but it's clear that it can't be reached. Attempts at realizing the self, he says, as he calls it, are only half of the psychological truth. The other half, he explains, is that there are too many forces that make it unlikely that there can be that realization, mainly because it goes against our insistence of self-assertion. It negates free will. So the idea there is something which is the divine within you, which is actually responsible for all of your deeds, which brought you here to this talk, which actually operates as your sole means of your life. Everything else is just a result of that. It's a very hard thing to give up and say, well, what about my own free will? What about my choices? So it's very hard to actually have that work when you're trying to explain the self, because people say, well, I just can't buy it. The number of times I've tried in various seminars, candidates to a training to be analysts, and saying, look, just sit back for a moment and realize that there is something that's working through you. It's the self. It's the Holy Spirit. And that's responsible for everything you do. Everybody goes, no, you know, I'm not, how many of you believe that? No? Okay, well, what about the fact that it's in every religion and that's the essence of every religion and it's psychologically sound? Well, not really. People don't really want to take that in. Jung actually admitted, he said that the present attempts to achieve full individual consciousness and to mature the personality are so feeble that they carry no weight at all in relation to our historic needs. he was talking then about the difficulty with the church, but our problems now are such a great order of magnitude, it puts realization out of consideration completely. I like when I'm giving a talk to a large audience of Jungian analysts to ask anybody who's individuated, please stand up, you know, and there's just nobody around, and because it can't be fixed. And in Aeon, volume 9.2, he creates a formula of the process from using Gnostic ideas of individuation, but makes it clear that the very end point, the realization of the self, cannot be reached. In commenting on this, Marie-Louise von France explains that complete individuation, complete realization of the self will never succeed. The highest Jung ever puts it is an approximate state of wholeness that lacks perfection. So as a theory or explanation, the self therefore exists on a promise that will fail to be accomplished. And it can be criticized because of its weaknesses. But nevertheless, we are Jungian analysts where the self is alive and paramount. I believe actually that we all in some way orient our patients to its existence, consciously or unconsciously, equating it at one level with wholeness and maybe talking about it being the controller of the objective psyche. We therefore try to create room for its intellectual sense, somehow trying to explain what it is, relying on Jung's revelatory occurrences, not, I suggest, on our own realizations. So here's the question I need to address now. What are we then to do with the self, the primary construct of Jungian, the whole Jungian opus and the goal of the entire process, what every one of us who was trained was drilled into us about the self? What do we do with it in the consulting room with a patient? Do we undertake an analysis with no consideration of the self because, one, it's beyond our understanding, or also, secondly, it can have no explanation in a practical day-to-day therapeutic engagement? Or instead, do we keep it in mind, but with no need to talk about it or direct ourselves to it because it's always involved behind the scenes? It's the ruler of the inner world. So we can just wait patiently for it to emerge, content that it will eventually provide glimpses when it's ready to reveal itself. Or do we instead somehow orient to the self by our interpretations when we make them, and therefore seek to condition the mind of each analysand? Or do we specifically and deliberately work for realization of the self, you know, be its champion, try to direct the analysand to its presence, not only by the interpretation of symbols, but by inserting the idea of the self into the dialogue when appropriate by way of suggestion? Or could we go even further and commit to serve the self by actually educating and explaining the essence of life's goal, by presenting Jung's views with stories or analogies from other traditions where possible? The first obvious option, that the self will arise from its own mystery and reveal itself, so there's no reason for it to be discussed, is makes sense, even though the myth needs to be maintained somehow, given its importance. It will arise then, we can sit back and assume, naturally. It's only occasioned by the interpretation of symbols. This has great force for me, one expressed to me in a dream of an analysand or a patient, and that was, he comes up to a house and he knows it's the house of the old wise man. And the door was open, and he says, I entered in and I could see the old wise man walking around. But no matter how many times I called out to him, even coming close to him, he ignored me. I walked even close to him and tried to talk to him, but he didn't pay any attention to me or recognize my presence. And this dream offers the idea that the self reveals itself by its own symbols and expression, and one can't grab it by effort. You can't knock on its door. You can't convince it to actually do something. Nothing needs to be said by this argument, and the ego's work will not necessarily, even if it doesn't create a realization of the self, which is what we see in clinical practice. It then follows that its realization, if that's to occur, requires it to act through some consciousness that exceeds our understanding. It's some intervention by a higher order. It's not by us doing anything about it. But this approach, if you're thinking it through, runs counter to the view that the realization of the self requires more. It requires some means by which the ego can prepare itself, even though that arduous path, according to the collected works, is the work of a lifetime. And according to the dream, is not even up to us. Taking Jung's footnote in 1941, the ego's work can continue, but it's up to the grace of the self, and therefore we just concentrated on that work and not the self. So that leads me to the other option, and that's to accept the self becomes known only when consciousness is prepared or obliged to receive it. To do this, mental knowledge, providing some idea of the myth, talking about it, becomes useful in the ego's work in order for the self to become attractive. George Hoganson proposes that it must light up what he calls the phase space, a term from dynamic systems theory, where we have all possible attractors exist in psyche. So if we bring it to the ego, we explain its structure in psyche, we reveal its promise, the self becomes an essential element of what is occurring in explaining the stages of the ego's work. And if you took this option of bringing it forward and bringing it into the analysis, you'd understand that the revelation of the self, or you'd think, requires conditioning of the ego to accept its existence by growing that germ of an idea, offering the ego a possible way of finding a center to alter its fixed position. So the role of the analyst, if you accepted that formulation, is not to sit passively by to wait for the self to do what it will do in the ego's work, but for us to be a bridge between the conscious mind of the analyst and the analysand and the myth. In this, however, and most importantly, if you agree with that, the Jungian self may not be as efficient as other stronger myths. You know, these stronger myths in religious and spiritual traditions, Holy Spirit, as well as popular writing or culture, make the self understandable and in reach of the analysand. This was indeed Jung's approach. I mean, he used comparisons with other cultures to highlight the nature of the self. As Jung therefore states, even where an analysand has no convictions to any myth or religion, quote, there is a dialectical development of the mythological material which is alive in the sick man. In other words, there's some development of the mythological material in every person. And that material will always include the primordial idea of a guiding spirit, such as one patient says to me, I feel like my dead uncle has a hand on my shoulder. That kind of thing crosses all our minds. You know, something happened. Oh, I must be guided. I mean, to have that, or something which gives inspiration or creates a hero, such as Hermes whispering to Odysseus, or guidance given to the founder of religion, Jabril for Islam, or we could say even an evolutionary force at least. I mean, how the hell does COVID keep on moving into better and better states for itself? There's so many ancient myths that are no longer subject to proof. They don't need to submit themselves, as must the Jungian self. They're not confusing anymore as to the depth and nature of the guiding spirit. This is stronger in some cultures than others, but where the opportunity is available, it opens a gateway to consideration of the self, as Jung suggests. He says, quote, when certain doctors resort to the mythological ideas of some religion or other, they are doing something historically justified. He doesn't talk about specifically about the self, but he sanctions the use of myth more generally for the patient. He says, quote, if he can find the meaning of his life and the cure for his disquiet and disunity within the framework of any existing credo, including a political credo, that should be enough for the doctor. So this has led me to conclude that in some instances, in appropriate instances, a framework for the self may become more effective if I focus it away from the Jungian self towards traditions where the guiding spirit is a universal phenomenon. Jung was aware of this, I think, when in 1941, after little published recognition of the self among his colleagues, having not given any focus at the Eranos lectures from 35 to 41, nothing even said about it in the Tavistock lectures in 1935, just the briefest mention of it in the Terry lectures, he made this statement the same year he went to India. He said, quote, to experience and realize the self is the ultimate aim of Indian yoga. And in considering the psychology of the self, we would do well to have recourse to the treasures of Indian wisdom. In India, as with us, the experience of the self has nothing to do with intellectualism. It's a vital happening which brings about a fundamental transformation of personality. To have recourse to another tradition where the self is a vital happening is appropriate, as it allows one to sidestep any limitations of the Jungian self. Those traditions, it's not a myth, but the basis of one's existence. It's facilitated by there being some aspect of the inner Jungian self in most traditions that's essential to the tripartite structure that defines our relationship with God. There's a Father above, an intermediary, and there's a spirit within, the Holy Spirit. The spirit within, the Atman, the Holy Spirit, the Ruach, brings forward the impact of the spirit in daily life as the mover to the moved, as Jung calls it, and derives its strengths as is necessary for God to be present and active in the world. Jung knew this. In a footnote in Symbols of Transformation, as just one example, Jung derived inspiration, you can see, from a letter by Seneca, where he states, quote, "The Holy Spirit indwells within us, one who works our good and bad deeds and is our guardian." So that idea is universal. Jung was quite clear. He said, quote, and this is the important thing, he says, "Throughout we believe ourselves to be the master of our deeds, but reviewing our lives and chiefly taking into account our misfortunes and their consequences, we often cannot account for our doing this act and omitting that, making it appear as if our steps have been guided by a power foreign to us." I'll just tell you, just to conclude this so we can have some discussion. I've been working with a man who's an evangelical Christian, a Pentecostal, for 8 years since I've been in Australia. And I absorbed myself in his doctrine. I studied the Pentecost, its practices, its purpose. And one day when I mentioned to him about receiving the Holy Spirit as the realization of the self, he was actually quite relieved. He said, "Oh, I didn't want a new Jungian religion, but I now understand the work we were doing." And he fully accepts what we call the self. He just calls it the Holy Spirit. The idea now is for him that he's always guided. He's called to God, that he speaks in tongues because the self invades him and takes him over. It's a perfect match. It fits so nicely. And I think if an established myth is not useful or available, the person says, "I'm agnostic or atheist," the idea of a guiding spirit, a guiding dream figure, or an inner voice will be clearer than any idea of what Jung calls his virtual center and psyche. And the distance between the appearance of a guiding spirit and the self is not really great. The mere fact of the existence of a superordinate personality will most likely offer an orientation, and this is what the self requires. So I'm going to end, and I really need your help at this stage, because as I said, this is, it's not an easy topic, and I'm working through it for the JAP conference as well. I just like your views about it. I've interviewed maybe 30 analysts, and it's interesting. Some say to me, I'd never mention the self in all my years practicing. Others say, I always talk about the self as self and introduce it so people can get a feeling for it. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. So I'll stop there.
Leslie, obrigado pela sua palestra. Um tema absolutamente complexo, paradoxal por natureza. Vamos abrir para as perguntas, vamos ver o que a gente aparece como possibilidade de conversa. Por favor, quem quiser fazer perguntas, coloca o nome no chat e eu chamo, tá? Leslie, eu tenho umas 14 perguntas aqui para fazer. Vou começar com uma ou duas. Tentando articulá-las na justa medida em que eu vou pensando, tá? Você acha que talvez um dos lugares, ou o lugar aonde o Jung possa ter tido tanta dificuldade na conceitualização do self foi a tentativa de transformar uma experiência que é da tradição religiosa, uma experiência que é da tradição mística, uma experiência que é da tradição esotérica, em um conceito psicológico? Você acha que é esse trabalho que o Jung tentou fazer, transformar algo que é da experiência mística, religiosa, espiritual, em um conceito psicológico? Você acha que é nesse lugar onde ele hesita, acerta, se engana, se equivoca? Queria primeiro te ouvir a tua opinião sobre isso.
I think you're totally correct. He was taking something which was his own subjective experience and turning it into his psychology. And the thing that he was dealing with was very mystical or numinous. It overwhelmed him and changed his conscious position, what he thought before. He said that without this, I couldn't, and he says in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, without this Liverpool dream, I couldn't have gone on. I would have stopped my work. So you're totally right. But it raises an interesting thing, Marcus, and that is, when I say to people, if you ignore all that and just look at it as a good psychological idea, it makes even more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you say that both you and I actually are guided by something, and therefore we don't need to worry, everything's fine. If something happens, you hurt yourself, some dispute occurs, if you actually accept from a psychological point of view, without any kind of mystical belief or that there is something in you which exists in the brainstem, because neurobiology has said that there's a centering function in the brainstem. So if you say it's an evolutionary force, which everybody can accept, at that point, then you're fine. You could say, nothing can go wrong. Everything, it's just the self. It's taking me for a ride. So therefore, my life is just an adventure. So I think that's a fascinating thing about it, because you're totally right. But I think also by introducing it as a psychological thing, it actually is the greatest lever for giving people peace.
Leslie, deixa eu só comentar. Quando você fala, se nós pudermos adotar o selfie como uma boa ideia psicológica, é abrir mão do quê? É renunciar a quê?
Well, you're giving up a confused mind with a fixed position as to what life's about, and you're replacing it with the idea that it doesn't matter what you do, it's not your doing. You're just being taken. You know, it's an interesting thing. I met a sadhu in India, a place which I go so often, and he said to me, I'm not living in my personality. I thought, well, what does that mean? I'm not living in my personality. But he meant he was living in the self. I was living in the Atman. And therefore he was just so excited about his life. It was to him an adventure of consciousness. So that's what you get. And what you give up is what we all have, is a sort of confused psyche, which actually is full of our complexes and all the things that we will never be able to work out, and worries about illness and worries about the world. In some ways, we begin to give that up and we just rest. Somebody described it to me once as lying back in a warm bath, just relaxing. There's nothing to worry about. It's a difficult idea, but actually that's the idea that Jung offers you. He says to all of us, he said, that's what it is. That's what you should do. And so, but it's hard to accept because it gives up free will. Yeah, but I make all this stuff. This is my life. And Jung said, well, no, it's actually the ruler is actually that. So, I mean, in the end, you know, Jung used to say, anybody who thinks I'm a mystic is an idiot, the exact quote. But basically, he was a mystic, and that's because all of this is based on his revelations. He did have a mystical experience, which is in the black books. I've been trying with the heirs of Jung to actually get what's behind it, but they say no way. They're not giving it because they don't want to expose him as a mystic. Well, you know, all of us who are in this profession know that's what he was. Oh. These are great questions, Marcus. Thank you. Yeah.
Eu que agradeço, Leslie. Obrigado. Vamos abrir para as pessoas e a gente volta. Camila, você fez um comentário, você quer trazê-lo para a gente?
Patrícia Eugênio também pediu para fazer uma pergunta antes da Camila.
Desculpa. Então vamos lá, Patrícia, depois Camila, tá? Por favor, Patrícia.
Leslie, obrigada pela sua palestra, pelas suas palavras. Ouvir um estudioso do self dizer que o conceito de self é confuso me traz um alívio imenso. Poucas coisas me assustaram tanto na minha trajetória junguiana como ter dado uma aula sobre o self. Por quê? Porque, respondendo à sua pergunta, eu nunca mencionei o self na minha prática clínica. Uma frase como a sua, receber o Espírito Santo como realização do self, me causa um desconforto imenso, porque eu não acredito no Espírito Santo. Então, a minha pergunta para você é se isso me torna menos junguiana. Se é possível ser junguiana não considerando o conceito de self.
I don't think that's possible, but I think that Jung used many terms. He didn't actually equate the Holy Spirit. It was just my intervention. But let's just take, for instance, the fact that the COVID virus actually keeps on changing. all of a sudden it says, I think I can mess this person's life up a bit more if I add an extra spike or something. And the question is, well, where does that come from? Where's the intelligence that comes from? It's an evolutionary force. There's no doubt. So it doesn't require any kind of religious orientation at all. It's just the fact that there's something working through us. Jung called it centering function in the brain stem. He called it an evolutionary force. He called it God's will in the broadest sense of the term. So I think it's universal. It doesn't, I'm just trying to find a way, pardon me, in appropriate circumstances to actually help a patient to realize that there's something operating within them, which actually is a force which is dictating a lot of what they're doing. Not just the ancestors, not just the parental developmental issues, but there's something greater. Now, it's not my doing, it's actually Jung's doing. I mean, that's what he wanted. That's his revelation. In fact, if you take away the self from Jungian psychology, there is no Jungian psychology. There's an attempt, of course, with the London Developmental School to move away from the self, because Fordham translated it differently. He said, no, Jung couldn't be right about this. But nevertheless, I think I'm clear about this, that Fordham, even though he was one of the editors of the collected works, didn't speak German. So Adler was the one who was translating it. Fordham raised no objection. I went into this in absolute detail, no objection. Jung didn't check it, and the wrong translation came through. Even though in 1939, in a book called The Integration of Personality, which was a translation of those Eranos lectures, it had it right. It expressed the German was translated correctly. I think the developmental school is fine, but I believe that as a classical Jungian, as I prefer to see myself, the self is the center of it all. And also it actually, if understood by someone, gives them great peace, like that woman who was dying. She found from her own tradition that, in fact, the idea that this was all part of a journey. She was being taken on a journey and was going to end, but the journey was going to continue. I don't care if it's true or not. Psychologically, it was very powerful for her and helped her settle down. This is why, in terms of psychedelics, that psychedelics is so effective end of life distress, because it overwhelms the conscious mind, which sees it as it's just dying and brings to it sort of visions of sort of other beings that might exist, mushroom gods, or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, again, an excellent question. Thank you so much for that.
Eu só queria tirar uma dúvida, vocês me desculpem. Leslie, não há uma diferença entre um centro organizador e o mistério? Acreditar que existe um algo, não um alguém que está além das nossas forças, que está a despeito das nossas intenções, não é diferente de postular um centro organizador?
Yes. It was initially an organizing center for Jung. That's what the Liverpool dream was when he was in his 50s. However, he said, by realizing the center, you begin to see that it's a center that includes a circumference, a wider area. And that wider area contains glimpses of not cosmic totality, but that which is in the collective unconscious, which is the deeper archetypes of our existence. So he actually turned it more and more into the God within. more and more to having that sort of character of religious. I don't think religious things, you can keep it as a center. I don't think it's required to do that. But I feel that it would offer great peace to someone if they actually thought that there was another force within them. Psychologically, even though, you know, your guess is as good as mine, you know, hopefully we'll find out one day. But nevertheless, you know, it's just, we don't know. I can't say. I've had experience of that kind of thing and met people who have that. But I can't really say, of course, with certainty, but nevertheless, from a psychological point of view, it's carries forward. And the research, for instance, which has been done extensively in terms of people having different kinds of cancers, for instance, with breast cancer, the idea of having a sense of coherence developed by the idea that something is moving them through it makes for a greater psychological adjustment than it would otherwise. So if you ask me personally, I definitely feel there's something. I mean, it's not a doubt with me. I don't want to. Something's there for me. Something's doing it. Things just seem crazy. And one example, which I gave before you signed on, was that I was worrying about what's the dark side of the self. As I explained to just before the room was open. And I was thinking about what is the evil that's in the self? And just as I was thinking about it, I fell down a flight of stairs and fractured my shoulder. I think, well, you know, who's messing with me? You know, what's going on here? And I was explaining as well that just before I gave this big lecture on the self, all of a sudden I looked down and there's a round circle on my arm, and I thought, what the heck is that? And I went to the doctor and said, oh, that's a spider bite. And it was a perfect round circle. And I thought, okay, you know, I'm messing with the self. God knows what's going to happen after I give this lecture, you know, probably fall out the window or something, but who knows? You can't, you know, it's a real thing. The self is real. And I've spent a lot of time in that book for writing on mystical experiences. I interviewed 29 mystics, and I spent, you know, 30 times going back and forth to India, Thailand, to monasteries and to Cambodia and so on. And there were people who talked about it, not as an idea, but as lived experience. I now have no doubt that I don't tell people about my approach to it, but I definitely think it's a psychological wonder. And I think that's what makes his psychology so strong. Mm-hmm.
Obrigado, Patrícia. Ótima pergunta. Liliane, por favor.
Opa, boa tarde. Primeiro, eu gostaria de agradecer bastante essa palestra. É muito interessante a gente ouvir alguém sem certezas, né? E a minha pergunta é mais uma curiosidade e uma opinião que eu gostaria de ouvir de quem tem tanta experiência. Nos últimos 5, 6 anos, eu venho acompanhando um trabalho de um neurocientista brasileiro, Siddhartha Ribeiro. Ele trabalha no Instituto do Cérebro, e ele vem acompanhando o efeito de substâncias como a cannabis nos nossos cérebros, no nosso autoconhecimento e também na nossa percepção do mundo. A minha pergunta, que é curiosidade, gostaria de saber o que o senhor achar de usar a cannabis em 3 situações na análise. O analisando está sob efeito. Depois, outro, o analisado, no caso terapeuta, está sob efeito, e ambos está sob efeito. Seria essa mais uma curiosidade do que uma pergunta. Agradeço bastante.
Are you using the word psychedelics? Is that what you're saying? Psychedelics, okay. We had, I don't know if you saw, we had a conference. There were people there. Walter Bochet was there and other people from Brazil. We had a conference at Pacifica University based on the book, which was called Psychedelics and Individuation. And I think this was sponsored by the IAAP. And the conclusion is that psychedelics are very useful for intractable positions. In other words, when someone is facing a situation which they just can't change, PTSD, eating disorders, end-of-life distress. And in that situation, psychedelics offer the possibility of the option for change. And also that relates to dose. We had a man from Amsterdam who uses, believe it or not, psilocybin for every patient and microdosing. He gives them a little each time. And of course, you have the whole tradition of ayahuasca, the Andes people as well. We had so the reality is, for those, the research is very clear that for those, and this is what we recommended to the IAAP, that someone who's a psychedelic assisted therapist who does that training would be the person to do it. That it's inconsistent with Jungian analysis and the frame to do it. But for the normal person, I don't know about you, but I've had people come in and say, well, geez, I just had 20 ayahuasca, trips. And I said, well, how was that for you? They said, really great. And then they go into, but my mother has been bothering me about this and that. And I go, well, it didn't have any effect. I mean, you could tell looking at me, I'm a child of the 60s, so I had my own experiences then. I don't think it changed anything, but for situations where the conscious position is so fixed, I think it actually offers an opportunity to do so. And also the people that appear, what they call the machine elves in terms of ayahuasca, or what they call the mushroom gods for psychedelic, all of those are, I see, as manifestations of the self. This whole thing is whether Jung took mescaline. In the Philemon Foundation next year is going to produce these protocols of Anelia Yaffe about memory streams reflections. These are previously unpublished and quite controversial comments. And in one, Jung speaks about mescaline. Now, it's pretty clear. He thinks, Shamdasani, everybody thinks Jung tried mescaline, because he says what you're waiting for with mescaline in these experiences is something to come from behind the veil and reveal itself. And he was talking there about the self coming forward. So I think in appropriate cases, because it's legal in Australia for a psychiatrist to administer. So if somebody comes to me and, people don't necessarily tell you, but after, a couple of years, they say, oh, and by the way, I only have one meal a day, and you go, oh, I didn't know that was coming. And then you say, look, I think better you should see so-and-so and, have a look at that. But unfortunately, it's become big pharma. It costs a fortune each time they do it here. It's cheaper to fly to Costa Rica than it is to actually get it done on a regular basis. But it's definitely, that's what we recommended to the IAAP, and I think they're going to be circulating that information around. If any of you want to follow it up, just send me an email. Marcus has the email address, and I'll send you what we sent to the IAAP.
Muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Liliane. Martinha, querida, por favor.
Bom, obrigada. Muito obrigada pela palestra, que realmente é muito instigante, né? E eu fiquei com algumas coisas, né? Primeiro, uma frase, né, que você falou, né? O self é uma promessa. E eu acho que isso aí, para mim, é assim, alguma coisa que faz muito sentido, né? Promessa é alguma coisa que está, mas não necessariamente se realiza ou não, vai ser cumprido ou não, né? A promessa, mais como Derrida fala, né? É alguma coisa de sentido, né? Mas que não não traz em si a garantia da realização, né? Então, eu acho assim, muito interessante isso, né? E queria também saber um pouquinho, que você agora pontuou, nesse sentido, né, do self, né, como sentido, como caminho, alguma coisa, como uma realização, essa questão da sombra do self, a sombra, né? Como seria isso, né? Isso que você falou, né? O mal, mas assim, mas aí o self é o bom, então como é que isso fica? Começa a dicotomia novamente, né? E mais uma coisinha, só como uma interrogação, porque o Fordham, né? Ele fala do ego como um D integrado do self, né? Então ele usa um pouco essa questão do self, o ego sendo alguma parte pertencente, né? Meio como, né? Assim como Adão, né? Deus criando Adão, né? Então um certo de integrado faz uma é por aí, mas ele não coloca o self como sentido, então seria isso. Obrigada aí.
Yeah, as to Fordham, I think Jung would agree with the idea that there's a deintegration in the formation of the ego. It makes a lot of sense. But when he dismissed the idea of the self as other than the primary self, which is how he addressed it, and deviated from what Jung said about what the self actually is, I'm convinced that he did that based on a mistranslation into the English version of the collected works, which he was using at the time. I don't think anybody's pointed it out before, but he misunderstood because he actually dismissed the idea of totality. What Jung meant by totality is all of that which is conscious and all of that which is unconscious. So it's not cosmic totality in the sense of sort of understanding the universe or being one with God, or it's actually all that's conscious and unconscious, which includes the collective unconscious, of course, which is really, really deep. So I think, just taking your last question, I think that part about deintegration seems sound. I think we all work with that from a developmental point of view anyway, when we're dealing with developmental issues for patients. There's no controversy. It's just that he built his whole idea of the primary self on the rejection of Jung's concept of the self. Remind me again what your first question was, because can you repeat that?
Marta, ele está pedindo para você repetir a última pergunta.
Eu não entendi. É para repetir o quê?
A sua pergunta, a última,
A
que
minha
você fez,
pergunta.
a última
A última pergunta,
consideração
Martina.
sobre a sombra.
Eu perguntei da sombra, o que seria a sombra, né, desse self, né, o mal.
It's interesting that my mind immediately blocked out that question. You know, didn't want to know about the dark side again. There's no doubt that if the self embraces totality, or is capable of it, he said it's the center, but also can include the circumference to the extent that's realized, that contains everything. It's got its own purpose. It has agency, as he described it. It carries out something for a purpose which is beyond us, which it would include evil as well as good. It's not just good in the sense of which Jung spoke about in the church as pravitio boni, the idea of the absence of God. He said there's real evil out there. And excuse me if I don't want to go too deeply in it, because I've had so many bad encounters by talking about it. It's as if the self says to me, look, don't mess around with it. Have respect. It's got a particular solemnity to it. It's not just a floating idea. You know, there's a man some time ago who was, and I asked him to go to, because he was so involved with it and he was talking about the self. I asked him to please go to because he was traveling, and I said, go to a particular Sufi shrine in India, in a place called Ajmer, because there you can see that the self is very solemn. It's not just a plaything. It's real, and it actually can sort of both take you on a wonderful journey and also take you on a difficult journey. It can give you illnesses. It can give you all of this. Now, again, it's not just me speaking. That's what Jung says it is. And that's how he lived his existence that way. But if you think for a moment what it's like when he was asked in that BBC interview, you know, do you believe in God? He said, I don't believe I know. He was speaking at that time about the self. So I think it's an invitation to all of us to embrace it in its fullest. We don't have to be an analyst, but at least we have the privilege of being invited to do it. Yeah. So I apologize for not going deeper into it. I'm looking around, see if anything's going to fall on me, but it's a bit more subtle than that. So we'll see. If anything happens, you read about my obituary, you know what happened. That was that one question that sparked it off, and she killed me with that question. Yeah.
Não vá deixar que essa marca recaia sobre nós brasileiros. Por favor, Selfie, por favor.
Nem sobre mim.
Nem sobre você, Martinha, nem sobre você. Obrigado, Martinha. Rafaela, por favor.
Olá, pessoal, boa noite. Na realidade, eu não sei se é pergunta, dúvida ou muito mais, né, jogar uma fala para poder pensar junto. Marcos, a sua fala, na realidade, assim, antes da sua fala inicial, era a pergunta que eu queria fazer, e aí você trouxe a sua pergunta inicial, eu vou meio que aproveitar dela para completar, né, a minha provocação, vamos dizer assim. Fiquei pensando, né, se talvez a dificuldade de Jung em escrever mais sobre isso estava ligada à dificuldade de traduzir a experiência religiosa como um fenômeno psicológico, ou se, na realidade, a dificuldade da própria academia, da própria ciência, né, da própria instituição em aceitar a existência do espírito como uma condição do humano, né, como uma condição da vida, não só apenas como condição do humano, mas como uma condição da vida, assim. E se isso até hoje não nos coloca nessa dificuldade em aprofundar sobre esse mito, construir melhor a respeito disso, porque a gente ainda paga por o ranço do racionalismo, do materialismo, do iluminismo ainda muito unilateralizado, em que matou Deus, em que matou o espírito. Então, essa conversa é uma conversa de interditada, né? E eu fico pensando, né? Eu acho que Jung não... Fico pensando aqui comigo, tá? Eu acho que Jung não teve dificuldade. Acho que Jung teve cautela. Porque talvez, se naquele momento ele tivesse sido ousado, ele poderia ter sido silenciado. Eu tive muito essa impressão quando eu concluí Memórias, Sonhos e Reflexões. Porque, inicialmente, eu tinha uma ideia de Jung covarde, de não ter bancado, né? Sustentar essa ideia. E depois eu disse, não, ele foi um sábio, né? Eu acho que o modo como ele colocou foi o que oportunizou da gente, até hoje, estar podendo discutir isso. Porque senão teria sido interdição navalha na carne, né? Teria sido uma interdição em que teria matado sem ter possibilitado a germinação da gente, até hoje, ter abertura para poder discutir essa teoria. Então, muito mais não fala de provocação, tá?
I think it's totally correct. In 1941, when he spoke with to the Swiss Psychological Society, he sort of avoided talking about the self. And there are very many instances where he had those lectures where he avoided it. So you're totally right. He was, and it's very difficult outside the context of a Jungian community and their relationship with patients to actually speak about it. As I found out a couple of weeks ago at the university, I was shocked. I got a wave of protest. People just kept on saying, no, 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 makes no sense. You know, this is the academy. I thought, well, I'm never doing that again. That was a real mistake. But thank you. That's exactly right. Your comment is, I accept it as completely true.
Obrigado, Rafa.
Marco, só uma última,
Claro, à vontade, vai.
observação que eu acho importante também, né, pontuar, assim. Isso é um elemento tão forte de que, muitas vezes, uma das coisas que eu venho observando inclusive, a procura de certos pacientes por analistas que acreditem nessa condição da existência. Porque, às vezes, assim, e eu coloco isso no seguinte termo, né? De sair de um analista que não aceita essa condição, fazendo esse tipo de mudança, para a pessoa conseguir ser no seu ambiente, para a pessoa conseguir poder entrar com toda a honestidade possível no seu próprio processo terapêutico, assim. E eu acho isso muito impactante, porque acaba, de algum modo, sendo uma denúncia de que o modo como eu me relaciono com esse conceito, né, de self, eu posso atrair, né? Ou eu posso oportunizar ou não que o meu paciente ele consiga se sentir à vontade para poder não se incomodar em falar, por exemplo, sobre experiência mística, sobre mediunidade, com medo de não ter o meu olhar atravessado de que essa pessoa está tendo um surto psicótico e que isso é uma alucinação ou um delírio, né? Então, eu acho isso muito importante também considerar, porque isso é um lugar muito revolucionário, né? E é um lugar de muito acolhimento do paciente poder se sentir seguro de não ter medo de colocar essas suas experiências e considerar essas suas experiências no seu próprio processo terapêutico.
You know, in Jung's terms, that's all brought about by the self. That person will come and see you and not someone else because of the self. And again, even if one says that's too mystical or whatever, from a psychological point of view, it's so much better to understand that, because it solves all the inconsistencies. It solves the conflict of opposites. And I think that's what he really was trying to do, find a way, because of his whole platform, which was to solve the issue, you know, which he wrote about in his 7 Sermons to the Dead, that our job is to solve the conflict of opposites. So therefore, the only way to solve it is by having a third thing. And he called it the transcendent function. But beyond that is, of course, the idea of coming to some peace, and that requires the self. So if you're the person who actually understands that, I think those are the people who are going to come to see you. They'll know. They're the ones who'll knock on your door, and, you know. And if you're not like that, if you have, then people will come to the other places. And it's not a matter of sort of even necessarily having to believe it. It's the actual pinnacle of what Jungian analysis is. It offers the opportunity to realize that not only the centering function, but something else consistent with other religions is actually working for you. Yeah, so that's great. I mean, I find that the people who come to see me sometimes teaching me things, of course, as they do you, they're the wrong people. I find doctors almost impossible to see, because there's no sort of room for that kind of thing, even the miracles, and lawyers, very, very difficult. But nevertheless, they find their place. And according to me, it's not to do with me, it's the self. Yeah. But I can tell that, you'll have that in your practice, I'm sure. Yeah.
Obrigado, Rafaela. Lu, vamos lá, Lu?
Vamos lá. Leslie, obrigada pela sua apresentação, super complexa e intensa. Eu queria responder a tua pergunta que você fez sobre a nossa utilização do self na prática clínica, né? Eu nunca usei também a palavra self na clínica. Na verdade, a única vez que eu usei a palavra self foi quando eu fui defender a minha dissertação de mestrado e eu estava muito nervosa e eu falei que o self me ajude. Então, em algum momento, lugar, eu imagino que eu acredito no self, né? Então, e aí eu entrei para a psicologia arquetípica, acho que até um pouco por conta disso, né? Eu consegui estudar a psicologia junguiana sem ficar muito nesse conceito do self. Só que você falou do self no momento da sua palestra sobre a questão do livre-arbítrio. E quando você mencionou essa questão do livre-arbítrio, eu me lembrei de um conceito que o Hillman usa muito e que eu uso também na minha prática clínica, que é o daimon. E eu fiquei pensando se existe alguma proximidade, alguma semelhança, algum link que a gente possa fazer entre daimon e self.
I think it's the same thing.
Ah.
The idea, because the whole idea of the daemon is just that which guides you, and which is similar in a sense to an objective psyche. There's something separate which is carrying you along. So yeah, it's very similar. But he didn't like the idea of the self, Hillman. He thought of it, and the truth is, it's so hard to figure out what Jung actually meant. I don't know if you've read that there's going to be a new edition of the collected works, which will not have any analysts involved, but Sham Dasani will be doing these things. 26 volumes of trying to look at everything he said in chronological order. I think that's part of our not so much a scholarly need, it's just part of a sort of desperate attempt to really figure out what Jung really meant, to try and hold the Jungian standard up a bit higher. I think it's a mistake myself, because I think Jung comes alive in the clinic, not so much in his writings. And I think the use of the daemon would actually make you wide open to any kind of experience that you get. If you'd be accepting whatever came, because you'd see that in others as well. It's a source of compassion also, because they have it, you have it, so you're talking heart to heart. Yeah, but I think just quickly, I think in answer, it's definitely, as far as I'm concerned, the same thing. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, because when the book was written about Hillman, I was the editor. I edited the manuscript and really got into this whole idea of what was he talking about, because he wasn't that clear himself. And I think really he was talking about the same thing, but didn't like the way Jung expressed it. So using daemon is just another way of saying there's something happening which is moving you along. Yeah.
Obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Leslie, duas perguntas para terminar. Pode ser?
Só uma coisa, desculpa, é que a Sônia Labate está com a mão levantada há bastante tempo.
Ah, eu nem vi. Oi, Sônia, tudo bem?
Oi, tudo bem?
Sônia, quando for assim, escreve no chat, porque às vezes eu não vejo. Tá bom?
Ok. Parabéns, Dr. Stein, por sua palestra foi muito iluminadora. Muito obrigada. Primeiro, aquilo que o senhor comentou sobre os riscos de lidar com a sombra, e o senhor falou em sair pela janela, por favor, não saia voando aí, que nós ainda precisamos muito do senhor. E quanto à questão que eu tinha pensado, o senhor mais ou menos já mencionou, mas o senhor acha que a publicação do livro vermelho trouxe algum tipo de esclarecimento sobre essa confusão, digamos, que o Jung fez com a noção do self ao longo dos seus escritos? E também gostaria de saber qual é a busca que o senhor está fazendo pelos livros negros e que a família dele está negando. Quer dizer, o que o senhor está querendo que eles não querem dar. É isso. Obrigada.
Well, thank you for that question. In terms of the Red Book, there were fantasies that Jung had, which were pretty overwhelming. They were the same, very similar to the ones that Nietzsche had and the poet Holderlin. These very intense experiences. And what he said in the Red Book is enough for me, which he said, I let myself drop. And below the surface, I found a richness which I hadn't seen before. So to me, the Red Book stands as a, you probably could see it there. I've got it up on a stand there over in, I think I can't point to it, but I think over here. You can see that it's, no, it's the other side, sorry. But I've got it up on a stand and I look at it periodically and I look at his mandalas. And just to me, it's a statement. I don't know what it is to you, but it's a statement about this was a different kind of person Jung was. He was an exceptional person. He was definitely of genius level. However, to me, the person who stands beyond that and explained it is a man called Aurobindo. I don't know if you've heard of Sri Aurobindo. Bindu. So Aurobindo explains these things. Whenever I'm looking for a real explanation, when I get lost in Jung, I go to Aurobindo. Jung was to meet Aurobindo and decided in the end, well, they're all the same. I've been down in Pondicherry and I saw the letter in the Aurobindo library where Jung said, I'm not coming. He said, basically, I see one of you guys, you're all the same. So he had certainly his blinders on. You were asking me, tell me the second question again, which is the one that.
Qual a sua busca pelos livros negros e qual o motivo o senhor imagina que a família não quer desvendar?
Well, in the black books, Jung says, I'm not sure which one it is, but Jung says, I wrote to Emma that I had a mystical experience. So having written about mystical experiences and having that is such an interest of mine, I then met the Jungs at the conference in Eranos. And I was sitting with Carl Christian Jung. And I said to him, can I have access to this? He said, well, you'll have to write to somebody else. So I wrote to all of the heirs and I said, I'd just like to have a look at it and see what that letter was to Emma Jung. So he then says, you should contact Anne Lammers, who's working on the collected works of Emma Jung. And she said, well, I don't have that myself. And then I tried. I just went all over the place. And I tried anybody who might actually have that. In the end, it's because that would mean that you're writing a whole thing about his mystical experiences. And again, this is an attempt to keep him within the scientific community. to make him actually seem like he was really a psychologist, not just a mystic. So I've given up on trying to get it now. I'll see them again. There's another Eranos conference. I'm not sure exactly when it is, but when it comes up, they always come to that, and I'm going to see if I can grab them, shake them and say, let me have a look at it. But that door is closed. It's just opens a peep, and then they let a few things out, and then they shut it again. It's been their source of wealth for a long time as well. Remember, the Red Books made them an absolute fortune.
Yeah.
It sold so many copies. And every time that there's a dealing with them with the Philemon Foundation, just letting a little out at a time. So I feel that I just have, I can't expect to have any access to it, but I'll try. I'll try. It's of interest to me, but not enough to sort of, I can't do anything more. I've tried as hard as I could. They're very polite. Thank you for inquiring, they say, but no.
Muito obrigada.
All right.
Obrigado, Sônia. Leslie, só fazendo um comentário sobre essa tua resposta. Você acha que os anos da maturidade foram fazendo com que o Jung fosse ficando mais confortável com esses temas, menos preocupado com a persona científica e ficando mais à vontade em redigir cartas como essa, em falar nos seminários? Você acha que os anos da maturidade, né, dos anos 30 em diante, modificaram a relação do Jung com esse tema? Essa não é a minha última pergunta, não, tá? Isso é só um comentário.
Right. Well, I think as we were speaking about before, you're either so inclined to that orientation or you're not. If you are, then you read Jung through that lens. That's how I read it. But I think it's, if you want to actually make it stick in a scientific community, then you'd look at the neurobiological research, which confirms some of Jung's work, as there's been in relation to the brain stem and the centering function. But I look at it more as really a journey which he's offering. And that journey is related to the self. I feel that the other material about training people to become psychoanalysts and looking at Melanie Klein and all that is quite interesting. Finding a way to proceed is quite interesting. But if you are so inclined, then Jung says to you, oh, look, this is a mystical journey, this whole thing. It's all about sort of being receptive, receptivity being the most important thing. The only way you can be receptive is if you are willing to alter your conscious position. And if you're not willing to alter your conscious position, then you get a different version of it. There's somewhere Jung says, even if I work with the most boring people, I still continue, but there's a lot of it that's left out. I think is what I've really tried to do is really try to work out what it really means to me through the novel writing. That book, The Psychoanalysis of Dr. Seal, is now delayed, but it should have been out now, but it's going to be published in a few months in New York. And it's really about a doctor, what I always find interesting, distinguished surgeon, finding the self in spite of himself. Because the moment he decides that he's sort of interested in this, well, all of a sudden things start going wrong for him. And that forces him to psychoanalysis. and then he begins this whole process of discovering it. So that to me is what this is about in my life. And so the work I do, or the research, is most importantly connected just to that. And I think we all have different views. There's that book, whose Jung is it? Who owns Jung? And I don't think anybody does. But the idea of coming out with a critical edition, which has just been announced this week from Princeton University Press, with Sham Dasani behind it, step by step, I think is definitely not where Jung needs to go. Maybe to make it just completely a thing of connecting up the dots as to what he said when and where he was standing and so on. But I think you can immerse yourself too far in Jung, and you lose, you can't see the wood for the trees. If you said to me, where was he on April 1st in 1936, I could probably tell you, I probably couldn't tell you what he was wearing, but I'm almost at that. So I'm pulling back from that side of Jung. So I think it lies in the self, in the mystery of who he is. I don't know what do you think, Marcus?
Perfeito. Leslie, duas perguntas finais para a gente encerrar o nosso encontro. Primeiro, um exercício de prognóstico, futurologia. Num mundo secular como esse que nós vivemos, dominado pela tecnologia, pela abstração, um mundo conceitual, um mundo performático. Que lugar haverá nesse mundo para uma psicologia inteiramente montada sobre um conceito como self? Ficaremos reduzidos a um gueto, falando para nós mesmos, ou essa teoria tem um lugar nesse mundo? Qual é o teu prognóstico?
Well, I wrote an essay on this, which is in one of Murray Stein's book about the Red Book for Our Time. I don't know if you know, have you seen whether that's been translated or you've seen it? It has, okay. So I wrote an essay about Jung in the community. And at one point early on, after he had that Liverpool dream, he drew a mandala, which I won't waste your time by finding at the moment. And that mandala had a big glowing self in the middle of it, but then around it, it was little tiny areas, all of which had roads going towards the self. And my belief is that because of the formula in Aeon, which says that the next stage of realization of the self is seeing the self in other people. And when you begin to see yourself in other people, you begin to understand the question of community. You begin to approach people not through an intellectual framework, but rather through feeling, through compassion, because they're going through their own journey of the self. But it's interesting you raise this, Marcus, because I mentioned there's this conference it's in Strasbourg in June, and it's called the IAAP Values Conference. And my job is to talk about community in light of the self, just that. So I feel that there's a great duty that one has to actually connect the self with the community. And I think that it's incumbent upon a person to actually, to the extent that they're capable of, to move closer to helping people on the basis that the self needs to be manifested in more people, maybe through working, which I do with the homeless or whatever is possible. But it's in that book of essays where I really try to sort of come to grips. So that's definitely. So you said you had two questions.
Tá. Só para lembrar que o Hillman ele acaba usando essa expressão, o self como interiorização da comunidade. Acho que por um caminho ou outro ele se aproxima um pouco disso que você está falando. Minha última questão, bem através de uma leitura da psicologia arquetípica. É uma pergunta. Eu posso pensar que o self é uma ficção, é uma ideia psicológica boa, que funciona para mim, e tudo bem? Self como ficção. É uma ficção que me sustenta, que me organiza. Essa é uma possibilidade?
It's a possibility. There's no judgment that can be accorded because there's different, according to Jung, it's a long continuum. It's not a single fixed thing. It's not a thing itself. It's a psychic object because we have to refer to it within psyche. But whatever view is there, the only thing is what it promises you, should you be able to see it more than a fiction, is that it promises you the opportunity to be at peace. It's a direct offer, because if in fact those, you want to keep it at arm's length and make it a fiction, but should you actually, I'm not saying you should, but should you accept it and think you sitting here now, for instance, is the work of the self, and that you going about your day tomorrow is going to be whatever the self actually demands. It'll do it. You don't have to worry about a thing. Imagine what peace that would bring. It's like, for instance, in a sense, someone put it, you'd lose your head. You wouldn't need to think about anything. You just go, okay, well, now what am I supposed to do? Well, I don't have to worry about it. Somebody dislikes me. Well, it's not my doing. I'm not doing that, etc. And when I've seen that in the faces of people, when I did that book on mystical experience, when I've seen that fact that people actually live in the self, not to the extent of like Ramana Maharshi or these people who are just, beyond what we can understand, but ordinary people, it brings a kind of peace, both to the community and the individual. So I'm sure that Jung had that as an invitation. In the end, he just couldn't prove it. So he said, oh, well, look at dream symbols. But I'm very glad that I became an analyst to be closer to it and to watch it unfold in the patients. But it certainly, I think, is an essential Western version of that concept of an evolutionary force working through us and giving us meaning. Yeah. Anyway, I hope to see you all at the...
Leslie, só
Yes.
para os menos afeitos ao conceito de self, você nos diria que Deus estará presente, convocado ou não? É isso?
But who will be present?
God.
How can I tell you? I couldn't say a word. What I can say is that, and it doesn't need to be something transcendent. It doesn't need to be something which is beyond sort of us into some magical sort of realm. But it is something which is the other in psyche, which is what Jung then equated with the purpose of why the God images appear, why people have images of God. But for me, it's unnecessary. To extrapolate it to that. But when I find a person who has that already in them, like the Pentecostal, well, I'm pleased. If somebody walks in and says, I'm an evangelical Christian, I go, great. We're going to really now, take this closer to the self. So whether it relates to God or not, I don't know. For me, it's not even a question which I need to contemplate, because how am I supposed to know? But I do feel that the self is absolutely real and substantial, and also there's a particular dignity and integrity to being in that space. And it also is a sort of has a solemnity of purpose, just like, as I mentioned, like to do with the coronavirus, is something which is a force working through us, moving us in some direction, which I can't fathom. But as to God, no. I think you were giving me a leading question, weren't you? It's my lawyer's side. It's a leading question, yeah. But the answer is no. I wouldn't actually equate it with that. The God image. People come up with God images. I say, well, that's an image of projecting that other out onto something. Yeah. What about you? How do you see it?
Se eu puder chamar de Deus, como Jung diz, tudo aquilo que me atravessa, seja para o bem ou para o mal, e que eu não tenho controle algum, se eu puder chamar de Deus todas as escolhas que eu fiz na vida e não entendo por quê, e deram tão certo, sim, eu te diria que Deus estará presente, convocado ou não.
That's wonderful. We all should applaud that. Yeah, in each of us, yeah, which is exactly what's behind the whole idea of the self. It's a person who's realized the self, to which we all need to bow. It's great. I was going to say, it was great talking to you all, and I look forward, if you're coming to Zurich in 2025, definitely let's all catch up and say hello. Be great to see you all there. It's a long way from Australia, but I'm definitely going.
Leslie, queria muito te agradecer por você estar aqui conosco. 2 horas de uma conversa. É um tema árido, é um tema duro, é um tema paradoxal, de difícil apreensão, mas foram 2 horas de uma serenidade. A maneira como você aborda o tema, a maneira como você apresenta os argumentos, a tua voz suave, o teu jeito manso, foi muito bom. Foi muito bom. Queria te agradecer no meu nome, no nome da Luciana Ximenes, no nome da nossa queridíssima tradutora Isa, do Tiaços, pela tua imensa generosidade em compartilhar a tua experiência teórica, pessoal, conosco. Muito obrigado. Acho que o self deve ser algo assim, deve ter esse tom, deve ter esse cheiro. Muito obrigado.
Thank you all.
Espero, espero que nós possamos nos ver em Zurique. Caso não seja possível, já deixo aqui um convite para que você volte aqui ao Tiaços para falar de outros temas, de outros livros. Foi um prazer te receber. Queria deixar isso registrado, de forma clara. Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Yeah. Goodbye to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Pessoal, voltamos com o Tiaços. Lu, quando é que vai ser próximo?
12 de abril, com a Helena Becil Morozol, Novas Heroínas no Cinema e na Televisão, uma perspectiva pós-junguiana.
Obrigado pela presença, gente. É um prazer recebê-los. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Bom fim de semana, tá? Até lá. Um abraço em todos.
Bye-bye.